General Hospital will reveal Kai had always believed that every opportunity that came his way was a well-deserved reward for hard work. He lived by the idea that success wasn't a matter of luck, but the result of persistence, dedication, and sacrifices made in silence. So when Drew, a highly influential businessman with an impeccable public image, offered him the chance to become the face of a new sports initiative, Kai saw it as a golden breakthrough. To him, this wasn't just a new job, it was the beginning of a greater purpose, the moment his name would rise beyond the sports world and resonate across industries. Drew didn't just praise Kai's athletic achievements, he promised bigger contracts, future leadership opportunities, and even suggested a path toward political involvement. Despite Trina's heartfelt warnings, Kai dismissed her concerns without hesitation. Trina had tried to explain that Drew was not as trustworthy as he seemed, that there were whispers about his unethical business dealings and manipulations. She reminded Kai that her own mother, Portia, had once been forced into supporting one of Drew's dubious public ventures under pressure. But Kai couldn't see past his own excitement. He believed Trina was overreacting, or worse, that her judgment was clouded by jealousy. From his point of view, Drew was offering him respect, opportunity, and a seat at the table, something Trina simply didn't understand. What Kai failed to realize was that he wasn't chosen for this opportunity solely based on talent or merit. Drew had a far more sinister plan in motion. He knew about Trina's feelings for Kai. He knew the complex family ties between Trina, Portia, and Curtis. And he had every intention of exploiting them. This wasn't about launching a sports campaign. It was a calculated strategy to use Kai as a pawn in his ongoing vendetta against Portia and Curtis, both of whom had stood in his way during a previous scandal involving hospital funding and public health policies. At the highly publicized press conference launching the sports initiative, Drew pulled every string. He created an atmosphere of celebration, inviting media outlets, city officials, and high-ranking members of the hospital board. Kai stood at the center of the spotlight, embraced by applause, flashing cameras, and lofty introductions. Drew, ever the master manipulator, used the moment to suggest that Kai might have a future not just in sports advocacy, but in politics, a natural leader, a role model, a voice for the next generation. The suggestion planted a dangerous seed in Kai's mind, one he hadn't considered before. Trina, watching from the crowd, felt her heart sink. She could see it unfolding, the way Drew wrapped her boyfriend in praise and promises, the way Kai's posture shifted as the idea of power and influence took hold. It wasn't just about sports anymore. Kai was being seduced by something far bigger, something far more dangerous. What made it worse was the contract Kai had already signed, believing it to be a standard agreement. In reality, the fine print handed Drew immense control over Kai's image, public appearances, and personal endorsements. It also legally restricted Kai from working with outside organizations or publicly distancing himself from Drew's ventures. With one signature, Kai had unknowingly handed over his independence, and Drew now held the strings. Trina tried once more to reason with him afterward, but he brushed off her concerns. He was in too deep. Drew's approval had become intoxicating, and Kai was convinced this was his destiny. But what neither of them knew was that the trap was only beginning to close. Drew had collected enough leverage, not just on Kai, but on Portia and Curtis as well, to blackmail them into compliance. He threatened to expose Portia's past medical cover-ups unless she cooperated with his upcoming campaigns, and Curtis, deeply protective of Trina, found himself torn between his principles and his daughter's safety. Kai, caught between ambition and betrayal, couldn't comprehend the full scale of the manipulation. He was now a symbol, a weapon Drew would wield not only to destroy reputations but to dismantle entire families. And Trina, feeling the weight of helplessness, knew this was far beyond what she could fix on her own. She would have to fight not just to save Kai's future, but to keep her family from collapsing under the pressure of secrets, lies, and the relentless grip of a man who had already proven he would stop at nothing. Not long after the glowing press conference and Drew's carefully staged praise, Kai found himself presented with what appeared to be a formal business agreement, one that promised lucrative opportunities, public exposure, and long-term collaboration. Trusting the professional image Drew had meticulously built, and still under the illusion that this was a pivotal moment in his rising career, Kai signed the contract without hesitation. But what he didn't realize was that this document was far more than a simple sponsorship deal. The contract had been crafted by a team of high-powered attorneys, layered with clauses, sub-clauses, and legal terminology that obscured its true intent. Hidden among the promises of media training, travel stipends, and speaking engagements were stipulations that gave Drew near-complete control over Kai's public persona. Drew was now legally entitled to dictate Kai's social media presence, to approve any future brand partnerships, and to manage his schedule with little room for objection. More alarmingly, there were penalty clauses tied to vague notions of conduct and loyalty, which, if violated, would subject Kai to massive financial loss and reputational damage. But the trap went deeper. The contract extended beyond the professional. It allowed Drew to manipulate Kai's personal relationships, especially those connected to Trina and her family. Without even realizing it, Kai had become a pawn in Drew's broader vendetta. What he believed was a gateway to personal growth and public influence was, in fact, a set of shackles, binding him to a man with a dangerous agenda and no moral boundaries. By the time Kai began to sense something was wrong, it was too late. The first red flags came when his requests for independent endorsements were denied without explanation, and when his public statements began to be rewritten and approved by Drew's team. He noticed his schedule filling with appearances that had little to do with sports and everything to do with political optics. Then came the directives to attend certain events, pose with certain donors, and publicly support policies he didn't fully understand. When he questioned it, Drew reminded him, subtly, but with unmistakable menace, that everything was in the contract, and breaking it could be catastrophic. It was only then that the scope of Drew's manipulation began to unravel. Drew wasn't just using Kai to elevate a brand, he was using him as a weapon against Portia and Curtis. He knew about the secret Trina's mother had buried. Years ago, in a moment of desperation and compassion, Portia had altered the results of a medical file to protect a vulnerable patient from being exploited by a corrupt pharmaceutical donor. It was a crime she never spoke of again, something buried deep under her reputation as a principled doctor and hospital administrator. But Drew had the records. Somehow, he had obtained copies of the falsified documents and traced the act back to Portia. With this knowledge, he now held the power to destroy her career, to have her discredited in the medical field, and possibly charged with criminal conduct. And he made it clear, if Portia didn't cooperate, if she didn't support his next public health campaign, if she didn't sway Curtis into endorsing him politically, if she didn't keep Trina silent, he would release everything. Kai, devastated by the truth, was caught in the crossfire. He had unknowingly walked straight into a trap designed not just to ruin him, but to dismantle the people he loved. The shame of his naivety crushed him. He wanted to tear up the contract, walk away, undo the damage, but it was no longer just about him. Any wrong move could result in Trina's mother being disgraced, Trina being dragged into scandal, and Curtis losing everything he had built. The weight of that knowledge was suffocating. In Drew's hands, the contract became a noose tightening around all of them. And while Kai stared at the pages he had once seen as a path to greatness, he now realized they were the very chains that bound him, and those he cared about, to a future none of them had chosen. Trina, driven by fear, desperation, and love, found herself standing on the front lines of a battle she never wanted to fight. When she finally confronted Drew, it was not with hesitation, but with fierce determination in her eyes and fire in her voice. She demanded that he release Kai from the suffocating contract, that he stop manipulating her family, that he walk away before things spiraled further out of control. But Drew, with his practiced calm and calculated cruelty, barely flinched. He listened patiently, smiled with cold amusement, and reminded Trina, quietly but unmistakably, that she was in no position to negotiate. Her intervention, far from helping, only deepened the cracks already forming beneath the surface. Drew took her defiance as a challenge, a reason to escalate. Instead of retreating, he doubled down on his threats, making it clear that if anyone attempted to sabotage his plans, the consequences would be swift and devastating. He revealed more cards, hinting at the network of surveillance and legal entanglements he had quietly constructed around the Ashford family. Trina, who had only sought to protect Kai, now realized her actions may have pushed Drew to become even more dangerous. Portia and Curtis, caught in the aftermath of Trina's confrontation, found themselves backed into a corner. Drew made it clear, unless they cooperated, unless they followed his directives precisely, he would go public with everything. He would leak Portia's falsified medical records, orchestrate a media smear campaign portraying Kai as a corrupt figurehead, and implicate Trina as an accomplice to both. And in Drew's hands, with his resources and political influence, it wouldn't be a simple scandal, it would be a complete character assassination. Faced with this horrifying reality, Portia had to make an impossible choice. Her entire career, built on integrity, compassion, and decades of hard work, was now hanging by a thread. But more than that, the safety and future of her daughter were at stake. Drew had exploited the one secret she had hoped would stay buried forever, and now he held it like a loaded weapon pointed straight at her family. With no one to turn to and no safe path forward, she agreed to his demands. She turned a blind eye to his unethical behavior, gave him access to confidential hospital files, and used her influence to subtly sway upcoming policy votes in his favor. Curtis, once a man defined by honor and principle, now stood at the edge of a moral cliff. He had always fought for justice, had refused to compromise even when the cost was high. But this was different. This was his daughter. And seeing the panic in Trina's eyes, the despair in Portia's silence, he understood that the rules no longer applied. He quietly reached out to a few board members, manipulating opinions behind the scenes to protect Drew's initiatives. Initiatives he knew were designed to funnel public resources into private gain. The guilt burned inside him, but the alternative was unthinkable. Meanwhile, Kai, who had once embodied passion, optimism, and idealism, was unraveling. The weight of his unintended complicity crushed him more each day. He replayed every moment, every signature, every meeting with Drew, wondering how he could have been so blind. The public still saw him as a rising star, but behind the scenes, he felt like a puppet with no strings of his own left to pull. The media praised him. The public adored him. But he knew the truth. His face, his voice, his very image had become tools for a man who would stop at nothing to gain more power. He started avoiding the mirror. He stopped speaking up in meetings. He barely slept. Kai's spirit, once bright, brave, and eager, had dimmed to something hollow and ashamed. He no longer believed he was in control of his life. He had become a symbol not of hope, but of how easily someone's purpose could be stolen and weaponized. Every time he looked at Trina, he felt a sting of guilt for dragging her into this nightmare. And every time he saw Portia and Curtis bowing to Drew's will, he understood the full magnitude of the damage he had helped unleash. In the shadows of ambition and deceit, the Ashford family stood fractured, each member carrying a different burden, each sacrifice carved into their identity. And Drew, standing at the center of it all, remained untouchable, for now. And then came the moment that changed everything. Late one night, behind the locked door of her office at General Hospital, Portia sat alone, staring at the dim glow of her computer screen. The hospital had grown quiet, the once bustling corridors now empty, but inside her, the storm was deafening. She had accessed Drew's medical file under the pretense of reviewing administrative documentation, an action that was ethically questionable at best, and illegal at worst. But desperation had long since blurred the lines she once swore never to cross. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the encrypted file, heart pounding in her chest. Then she saw it, a single line, buried deep in a classified report from a private clinic in Pennsylvania, marked confidential, physician only. She opened it and froze. What she read wasn't just a footnote in a chart. It was a secret so explosive, so damning, that it could shatter Drew's entire world if it were ever exposed. A neurological condition. One that, if made public, would immediately disqualify him from any leadership roles, political appointments, or corporate control. A condition he had gone to great lengths to hide, even falsifying some records and suppressing test results through corrupt insiders within the medical community. Portia's mind raced. This wasn't just leverage, this was a weapon. For the first time since Drew began tightening his grip around her family, Portia held something that could unravel his empire. She sat back in her chair, struggling to breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had discovered. The man who had extorted her, who had cornered Curtis, used Kai like a pawn, and threatened Trina's future, had a devastating weakness. He wasn't invincible. He could fall. And yet, the reality of what it would take to bring him down settled heavily on her shoulders. Using this information would mean crossing a line she had always feared. If she reported it through the proper legal or medical channels, she would have to admit to accessing his file illegally. If she leaked it anonymously, she'd become the very thing she despised, someone who exploited private medical information for gain. Either path risked her license, her reputation, and potentially her freedom. She could lose everything she'd built, everything she stood for. But the thought of doing nothing felt even worse. Portia had watched helplessly as Drew manipulated her loved ones, as he pulled Curtis into dark political games, as he turned Kai into a mouthpiece for corruption, and as Trina's spirit dimmed under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Every day, he grew more powerful, more emboldened. And no one, not the board, not the police, not the media, seemed willing or able to stop him. He was too careful, too connected, too untouchable. Unless she stopped him. For the first time, Portia allowed herself to entertain a terrifying possibility. What if it was up to her to take him down? What if she was the only one who could end this? The idea filled her with dread. It went against everything she believed in as a doctor, as a mother, as a woman of principle. But this wasn't just about ethics anymore. This was about survival. About protecting her daughter. About saving Kai. About pulling her family out of the hell Drew had created. She closed the file, her hand hovering over the mouse for a long moment, as if hoping the screen might erase itself. But the truth was seared into her mind now, etched into her conscience. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't pretend she didn't know. Portia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't want this power. She didn't want this choice. But if no one else was willing to put an end to Drew's reign of manipulation, then maybe, just maybe, it had to be her. Even if it meant destroying herself in the process. Because sometimes, justice didn't come clean. Sometimes, it came wrapped in blood, secrets, and unbearable consequences. And Portia was starting to realize that if she didn't act soon, there would be nothing left of the people she loved to protect.